That morning, I checked my bank account. $450,000, the savings of my entire lifetime, simply vanished. Not a single penny remained. A moment later, my phone rang. It was my only son. He did not say hello, he just said, "Dad, my wedding is tomorrow. I drained your accounts and I sold your house. You need to figure your own life out now. Good luck." I did not scream. I did not cry. I hung up the phone, tightened my coat, and prepared to destroy the wedding of the century. Before I tell you how a 77-year-old man dismantled a fake millionaire's empire in one night, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Hit like and subscribe if you believe blood does not give anyone the right to steal your life. The crisp autumn wind was biting through my coat that Friday morning. It was exactly 24 hours before my son Christopher was scheduled to marry his fiancée Stephanie in a lavish $500,000 ceremony downtown. I was standing inside a quiet local coffee shop in my suburban Chicago neighborhood, waiting to pay for a simple black coffee. I slid my debit card into the chip reader, expecting the familiar approving beep. Instead, the machine blared a harsh, flat tone. "Declined." I smiled apologetically at the young barista, assuming it was a simple bank error. I pulled out my phone, stepping aside to let the next customer order, and opened my banking application. My thumb hovered over the screen as the little blue circle spun, loading my financial reality. When the dashboard finally appeared, the breath completely left my lungs. Available balance, $0.00. I blinked, taking off my reading glasses and wiping them on my shirt before looking again. It was not a glitch. The primary checking account was empty. I quickly navigated to my life savings account. The $450,000 I had painstakingly accumulated over 40 years as a structural engineer, inspecting steel beams and pouring concrete in the freezing Chicago winters, was gone. That money was my safety net. It was the security I had built to ensure I would never be a burden to anyone after my wife Catherine passed away 5 years ago. Now a glaring negative sign sat next to a completed wire transfer. My hands began to tremble. I felt a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. As I stood there frozen in the corner of the coffee shop, my phone suddenly vibrated in my palm. The caller ID flashed Christopher's name. I answered immediately, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Christopher," I said, my voice tight. "Something is wrong with the bank. My accounts are completely empty. Someone hacked the accounts." There was no panic on the other end of the line. There was only a terrifying, calculated silence. "Dad," Christopher finally said. His voice was completely devoid of emotion. It sounded like a corporate manager firing a low-level employee. "Nobody hacked your accounts. I authorized the wire transfer this morning." I stood paralyzed. The chatter of the coffee shop faded into a muted hum. "You did what, Christopher? That is everything I have. Every single penny." "What are you talking about?" "My wedding is tomorrow, Dad," he said smoothly, as if that justified everything. "Stephanie's family expects a certain standard. I needed liquid assets to finalize the venue payments and secure a few things for my future. I withdrew the money. And just so you know, I also finalized the sale of your house yesterday. The buyers are moving their things in on Monday." My brain struggled to process the sheer audacity of his words. "You sold my house. You cannot sell my house. The deed is in my name. I never signed a single piece of paper." "I took care of the paperwork, Dad. You do not need to worry your tired head about it anymore," he replied. His tone was patronizing, dripping with a quiet cruelty that I had never heard from him before. "You need to figure your own life out now. The movers are already at the property clearing out the old furniture. Do not cause a scene. Good luck." The line went dead. I stared at the black screen of my phone. My own son. The boy I had carried on my shoulders, the boy whose college tuition I had paid by working double shifts, had just stripped me of my entire existence in a matter of seconds. He was throwing me onto the street less than 24 hours before he was supposed to stand at an altar and vow to be a good man. I did not waste time screaming. The analytical mind of a structural engineer does not panic when a building starts to sway. It looks for the failing load-bearing walls. I turned around, pushed open the glass doors of the coffee shop, and walked briskly down the sidewalk. I needed to see this with my own eyes. I hailed a passing taxi, throwing a $20 bill I had in my pocket at the driver. I told him my address and urged him to drive fast. The 15-minute ride felt like an eternity. My mind raced through the legalities. How could he sell my house? How could he drain an account that did not have his name on it? I had survived a mild dizzy spell last year, and Christopher had generously offered to help me organize my paperwork, just in case of an emergency. Like a trusting, foolish old man, I had let him handle the files. I had given the wolf the keys to the henhouse. The taxi turned onto my familiar, quiet, suburban street. As we approached my address, the reality of my son's betrayal hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. Parked squarely in my driveway, crushing the rose bushes Catherine had planted, was a massive, pristine white moving truck. The front door of my solid brick house, the home I had meticulously maintained for 3 decades, was propped wide open. I stepped out of the taxi, my legs feeling heavy as if I were walking through deep water. 3 large men in matching gray uniforms were walking out of my front door. Between them, they carried a tall, heavy object wrapped thickly in protective moving blankets. Even through the padding, I recognized the distinct curved shape of Catherine's antique grandfather clock. It was her most prized possession, a family heirloom that she had polished every Sunday until the week she died. "Hey!" I yelled, my voice cracking with an unfamiliar rage. "Put that down! What are you doing in my house?" The foreman, a burly man with a clipboard tucked under his arm, turned to look at me. He did not look intimidated. He looked annoyed. "Are you William?" he asked, glancing down at his paperwork. "Yes, I am William, and this is my property. I want you off my lawn right now, or I am calling the police." The foreman sighed, pulling a thick folder from his clipboard and holding it out toward me. "Look, buddy, I am just doing my job. The new property owners ordered a complete clean-out by noon today. I have the signed transfer of deed and the work order right here. We are taking the furniture to a storage lockup downtown." I snatched the paper from his hands. My eyes scanned the bold black ink. It was a legally binding deed of sale. It stated that the property had been officially transferred and sold. But what made my blood run cold was the signature at the bottom. It was my signature. Or at least it was a flawless, meticulous forgery of my signature. "This is a lie," I whispered, the paper trembling in my hands. "I never signed this. My son did this." "Take it up with the real estate agent or your kid," the foreman said, turning back to his crew. "Load it up, boys. We have 2 more rooms to clear before lunch." I stood on the sidewalk, a 77-year-old man, suddenly homeless, penniless, and watching the last physical memories of my deceased wife being shoved into the back of a dirty truck. The neighbors were beginning to peek through their curtains. To them, I probably looked like a confused, helpless senior citizen who had lost his grip on reality. But inside, a profound, terrifying calm began to settle over me. Christopher thought I was a relic. He thought I was a weak, trusting old man who would simply crawl away into the shadows and weep while he celebrated his luxurious wedding with my stolen money. He had severely miscalculated. I did not call the police. The police would look at the forged documents, declare it a civil family dispute, and tell me to hire a lawyer I could no longer afford. I needed answers straight from the source. I needed to look the boy I raised directly in his eyes. I turned my back on the moving truck, walked to the main avenue, and hailed another cab. I gave the driver the address of the ultra-luxury downtown penthouse Christopher and Stephanie were renting. It was time to pay the groom a visit. The cab ride to downtown Chicago gave me too much time to think. As the driver navigated the heavy afternoon traffic, the rhythmic thumping of the tires over the asphalt felt like a countdown to my own erasure. I leaned my head against the cold glass of the window, still clutching the crumpled copy of the work order the foreman had let me keep. My engineering mind, trained to find the structural flaws in any failing system, began to dissect the disaster of my own life. How had Christopher managed to sell a property that was solely in my name? I closed my eyes, and a memory from exactly 14 months ago surfaced with terrifying clarity. I had suffered a mild dizzy spell one afternoon while working in the garden. It was nothing serious, just a brief moment of dehydration and fatigue. But Christopher had panicked. Or at least he had pretended to panic. He insisted on taking me to a doctor. A few days later, he came to my house with a thick stack of legal documents. He sat me down at the kitchen table, poured me a cup of tea, and told me that we needed to be prepared for any medical emergencies. He said it was standard procedure for a man of my age to have his paperwork in order, just to make sure I would always be taken care of. I looked at the boy I had raised, the son whose baseball games I had never missed, and I trusted him completely. I signed every page without putting on my reading glasses. I realized now, sitting in the back of this taxi, that I had not signed simple medical directives. I had signed a comprehensive and durable power of attorney. I had legally handed my son the axe he used to chop down my life. The words of the moving foreman echoed in my ears, making my chest tighten with a suffocating grief. He had not just told me they were clearing out the furniture. He had looked at his clipboard and casually mentioned that they were under a strict deadline. The new owners were bringing in the bulldozers first thing on Monday morning. They were going to demolish the solid brick house I had built for Catherine. They were going to tear down the walls where we had celebrated every holiday, the kitchen where she had baked her pies, and the living room where we had watched our son take his first steps. My entire legacy, the physical proof of my existence and my marriage, was scheduled to be crushed into dust and hauled away in dump trucks in less than 48 hours. It was a complete and total erasure. The cab pulled up to a towering glass and steel high-rise in the most expensive district of downtown Chicago. I paid the driver with the last bit of cash in my wallet and stepped out onto the pristine sidewalk. The building exuded wealth. It had a sweeping marble entrance, polished brass fixtures, and a doorman wearing a tailored suit. This was where my stolen life savings had gone. This was the luxury my son felt he deserved at the cost of my survival. I walked through the revolving doors with a heavy, deliberate stride. The doorman looked up, ready to ask for my business, but I did not stop. I maintained the stern, authoritative posture of a man who belonged there. I slipped past the front desk while he was distracted by a delivery courier and stepped directly into the open elevator. I pressed the button for the penthouse floor. As the elevator ascended rapidly, my heart hammered against my ribs, but my mind was perfectly cold. I was no longer a grieving father. I was a man seeking the truth. The elevator doors slid open, revealing a private foyer that led straight into Christopher and Stephanie's apartment. The front door was slightly ajar, propped open by a stack of empty cardboard boxes. I pushed the door wide open and stepped inside. The living room was massive, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city skyline. But the room was in a state of chaotic extravagance. There were dozens of crystal wedding favors covering the dining table. Cases of expensive imported champagne were stacked against the walls. Massive floral arrangements of white roses filled the air with a heavy, sweet perfume. Christopher was standing near the kitchen island, dressed in a crisp designer shirt, holding a clipboard and barking orders into his phone. He looked up, and the color immediately drained from his face. He quickly ended his call and tossed the phone onto the granite counter. "Dad," he said, his voice dropping to an anxious whisper. "What are you doing here? You cannot just barge in like this." "Stephanie is in the back room getting her makeup done. We are leaving for the rehearsal dinner in an hour." I did not raise my voice. I simply looked at him, taking in the expensive watch on his wrist and the tailored fit of his clothes. "You stole $450,000 from me this morning, Christopher. You sold my house from under me. I am standing here because I want to know how you can look me in the eye after destroying my life." Christopher quickly crossed the room, grabbed my arm and pulled me into his private study, shutting the heavy wooden door behind us to muffle the sound. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair and let out a long, dramatic sigh. He was preparing to play a role. I could see the manipulation shifting into place behind his eyes. "Dad." "Please lower your voice," he whispered, putting his hands on my shoulders in a gesture of fake affection. "I know how this looks, and I am so sorry for the shock. But you have to believe me, I did not steal your money. This is just a temporary financial maneuver, I swear to you." "A temporary maneuver," I repeated, keeping my tone perfectly flat. "You call emptying my bank account and scheduling my home for demolition a temporary maneuver?" Christopher nodded rapidly, his eyes pleading. "Yes, Dad. You know Stephanie's father, Richard Caldwell. He is a billionaire. He is ruthless. Last night he threatened to call off the wedding unless I proved I had liquid assets. He demanded to see a portfolio before I could sign the prenuptial agreement. I panicked. I needed to show him wealth immediately. The house sale was a paper transfer to an LLC. The money is in an escrow account. I will reverse everything on Monday. I am just trying to secure my future." I pretended to breathe a sigh of absolute and complete relief. But then the heavy wooden study door slowly opened. Stephanie walked into the room. Around her neck was a brilliant, sparkling diamond pendant. It was a family heirloom I kept locked inside a biometric safe. How did she acquire that priceless piece of fine jewelry? The diamond pendant resting against Stephanie's collarbone was unmistakable. It caught the ambient light of the penthouse study, fracturing it into tiny rainbows that danced across the walls. That necklace was not just a piece of jewelry. It was the last anniversary gift I had ever given my late wife, Catherine. I had spent 6 months of overtime pay to afford that specific cut. After she passed away, I placed it inside a heavy steel biometric safe in the master bedroom of my house. The safe required my unique fingerprint to open. There was no override code. There was no spare physical key. As my eyes remained locked on the diamonds, my engineering mind began to run through terrifying calculations. If the necklace was here, it meant Christopher had not just sold the house on paper. He had physically dismantled my security. He must have hired a professional to drill the safe or bypassed the electronic locking mechanism while I was out of the house. The invasion of my privacy was absolute. He had completely stripped my life down to the bare studs. My chest tightened, and a wave of pure, unfiltered rage threatened to boil over. Every muscle in my body wanted to reach out, grab the necklace, and demand the truth. But I forced my hands to remain resting calmly by my sides. I remembered the power of an unstable structure. If you apply sudden force to a compromised load-bearing beam, the entire building collapses on top of you. I was standing inside enemy territory, outmatched in youth and resources. If I confronted them now, Christopher would simply call building security and have me thrown out onto the street. I needed to play the part he had designed for me. I needed to become the weak, forgetful, and easily manipulated old man. I blinked a few times, letting my shoulders slump forward to project a posture of fatigue and defeat. "Oh, Stephanie," I said, making my voice sound a little shaky and breathless. "You look absolutely beautiful today. That necklace really suits you perfectly." Stephanie offered a smile that did not quite reach her cold, calculating eyes. Her manicured hand drifted up to rest delicately against the diamonds. "Thank you, William," she cooed, her tone dripping with the kind of forced sweetness you might use when speaking to a small child or a confused patient. "Christopher told me you insisted I wear it for the rehearsal dinner tonight. He said you wanted me to have a piece of Catherine with me as I joined the family. It is such a generous gift. We both appreciate it so much." I swallowed the bitter bile rising in my throat. Christopher stood a few feet away, sipping from a crystal tumbler of water. He did not look at me. His cowardice was almost as profound as his cruelty. He had spun a narrative where my forced robbery was framed as an act of touching paternal generosity. "Well," I replied, keeping my gaze soft and unfocused. "You are family now. Everything I have is for the family." Christopher let out an exaggerated sigh, stepping forward to put a reassuring arm around Stephanie's waist. He looked at me with a manufactured expression of deep relief. "I am so glad we cleared the air, Dad. I know the sudden house sale must have been a shock, but like I explained, it was just a financial maneuver to protect our assets. I promise you by Monday afternoon, the escrow will clear, the title will be restored, and everything will go back to normal. You do not have to worry about a single thing." Stephanie stepped closer, pulling a glossy trifold brochure from the pocket of her tailored blazer. "And because we know the noise and the dust from the sudden house renovations must be so stressful for your heart, we decided to give you a little wedding gift of our own." She held the brochure out to me. I took it with trembling hands, staring at the cover. It displayed an idyllic picture of vibrant silver-haired seniors drinking iced tea on a sunlit golf course. The bold cursive letters across the top read, "Sunny Meadows Wellness Retreat. We booked you a full month in their premium suite down in Florida." Stephanie continued, her voice practically singing with artificial joy. "It is a luxury spa, William. You will have daily massages, tailored meals, and complete relaxation while we handle the chaos of the wedding and the house paperwork here in Chicago. The weather down there is beautiful right now. You deserve to rest." I looked down at the brochure. It was printed on heavy, expensive cardstock. It looked like paradise. It looked like the ultimate gesture of a wealthy, caring son ensuring his elderly father was pampered. "A private town car is coming to pick you up at 3 o'clock this afternoon," Christopher added, checking his designer watch. "The driver will take you straight to the private terminal at the airport. We already packed a bag with your summer clothes from the house. It is waiting for you in the trunk of the car. All you have to do is get in, sit back, and enjoy the flight. We will call you the moment we land from our honeymoon." I stared at the glossy pictures of the golf course, feeling the icy grip of reality tighten around my throat. 3 o'clock this afternoon. That was barely 2 hours from now. The efficiency of their plan was terrifying. They were not just stealing my money and selling my house. They were physically extracting me from the city. If I got onto that plane, I would be entirely isolated in another state while they executed the final phases of their theft. By the time I returned in a month, the money would be laundered through untraceable offshore accounts, the house would be demolished, and I would be left completely destitute. "This is incredibly generous," I said, forcing a small, grateful smile onto my face. "I do feel very tired lately. A month in the sun sounds exactly like what the doctor ordered." "Thank you, both of you." Stephanie beamed, clapping her hands together softly. "Oh, I am so glad you are happy, William. We just want what is best for you." Suddenly, the sharp ringing of Stephanie's cell phone pierced the quiet tension of the study. She glanced at the screen and let out an annoyed sigh. "It is the caterer again," she muttered, rolling her eyes. "They are threatening to substitute the caviar for the reception unless we approve the new delivery fee right now. I have to take this." She turned on her heels and marched out of the study, answering the phone with a sharp, demanding tone. Christopher immediately followed her into the hallway, pulling his own phone from his pocket to check an incoming message. I was left standing entirely alone in the center of the luxurious study. The heavy mahogany desk belonging to my son sat a few feet away. My eyes scanned the polished wood surface, noting the scattered wedding invoices and architectural blueprints for a new mansion. But it was not the desk that caught my attention. It was the sleek stainless steel wastebasket positioned just beneath the edge of the table. Lying right at the very top of the discarded trash was a crumpled, thick piece of white paper. The corner of the paper featured a very distinct, dark blue medical cross logo. My gut instincts, honed by decades of inspecting hidden structural faults, flared to life. The glossy brochure for Sunny Meadows in my hand suddenly felt too perfect, too light. I took a quick step toward the desk. I needed to see that discarded paper. I intentionally knocked my reading glasses off the edge of the table, letting them clatter loudly onto the hardwood floor. "Oh, my clumsy hands," I muttered loudly, making sure Christopher could hear me from the hallway. I bent down slowly, groaning slightly for dramatic effect, and reached for the glasses. While I was out of sight below the level of the desk, my left hand darted into the wastebasket. I grabbed the crumpled piece of paper with the blue medical cross and swiftly shoved it deep into the inner pocket of my coat. I retrieved my glasses, stood back up, and brushed off my knees just as Christopher walked back into the study. "Everything okay in here, Dad?" he asked, looking mildly suspicious. "Just dropped my glasses," I replied, offering a warm, harmless smile. "I think I should head downstairs and wait for that car. I do not want to hold up the driver, and I know you two have a wedding to finish planning." Christopher nodded, clearly relieved that I was leaving without causing a scene. "That is a great idea, Dad. Have a wonderful trip. We love you." He did not offer to walk me to the elevator. He simply turned back to his phone. I walked out of the penthouse, navigating the chaotic living room full of roses and champagne, and stepped into the private foyer. I pressed the call button for the elevator. The polished steel doors slid open silently, and I stepped inside. As soon as the doors closed, separating me from my son's stolen luxury, the facade of the tired old man instantly melted away. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the crumpled piece of paper I had stolen from the wastebasket. My hands shook as I carefully smoothed out the wrinkles against the smooth wall of the elevator. The dark blue medical cross logo belonged to a facility, but it was not Sunny Meadows Wellness Retreat. The document was a fast-tracked mandatory admission form. The name printed across the top in bold black letters was Oakhaven Terminal Care. It was a locked high-security psychiatric hospice facility located on the outskirts of the city. The admission date was marked for today at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And at the bottom of the page under the section for patient status, someone had checked the box that read severe late-stage dementia with no possibility of release. The elevator continued descending, but I felt the floor completely drop out from beneath me. I stared at the dark ink on the crumpled paper, my mind struggling to process the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. Severe late-stage dementia with no possibility of release. This was a death sentence. Oakhaven Terminal Care was notorious. I remembered reading a local news expose a few years ago about state investigations into their locked psychiatric wards. Patients sent there were stripped of their personal belongings, denied outside communication, and heavily medicated into permanent compliance. If I stepped into that private town car at 3 o'clock this afternoon, I would simply vanish. The doors of Oakhaven would lock behind me, and I would legally cease to exist as an autonomous human being. My son would have complete control over my health, my finances, and my confinement. I would be entirely cut off from the outside world, unable to call a lawyer, a friend, or the police. They had planned this with terrifying precision. They knew that an angry, lucid man demanding his money back was a massive legal liability. But an incapacitated senior citizen locked in a dementia ward was a problem neatly swept under the rug. I folded the paper carefully and slid it deep into the breast pocket of my suit. The elevator chime rang, and the heavy doors opened into the bustling downtown lobby. I stepped into the crowded atrium, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I needed to move fast. It was already past 1 in the afternoon. I had less than 2 hours before their hired driver arrived at the address they assumed I was heading toward. As I pushed through the revolving glass doors and stepped onto the noisy Chicago pavement, my hand instinctively reached for my smartphone in my pocket. I pulled it out to check the time, and a sudden chilling realization washed over me. Christopher set up my family phone plan 2 years ago. He was the administrator on the account. That meant he had full access to my location tracking services. If I went anywhere other than the designated pickup spot, he would see it on his digital map. He would know I was deviating from the script. I could not turn the phone off, because going dark would immediately trigger his suspicion. I needed a decoy. I walked quickly down the block, merging into the heavy flow of afternoon pedestrian traffic. A city bus pulled up to a busy intersection, just a few yards ahead, hissing as its pneumatic doors opened. I stepped onto the bus, dropping a handful of loose coins into the fare box. I walked all the way to the back, finding an empty seat near the rear exit. I slipped my smartphone out of my pocket, silenced the ringer, and pushed it deeply into the crevice between the plastic seat and the side panel of the bus. I stood up and exited through the rear doors just before the bus pulled away from the curb. My digital footprint was now heading south toward the suburbs, buying me the most precious commodity I needed: time. I walked 2 blocks until I found a brightly lit corner convenience store. I walked straight to the electronics rack at the back of the store. I picked up a cheap prepaid burner phone and a $10 top-up card. I carried the items to the counter, handing the cashier the remaining bills from my wallet. As soon as I stepped back outside, I ripped open the plastic packaging, popped the battery into the cheap plastic device, and activated the network. The screen lit up with a low-resolution glow. I had no contacts saved, but the numbers that truly mattered were permanently etched into my memory. I walked into a narrow alleyway, sheltering myself from the wind and the noise of the main avenue, and dialed a number I had known for 15 years. I waited through 3 agonizingly long rings before a gruff, familiar voice answered the line. Gregory sounded annoyed to be receiving a call from an unregistered number, but I did not give him time to hang up. "Gregory, it is William," I said, keeping my voice low and urgent. "I need your help right now, and I cannot explain it over the phone." There was a brief, stunned silence on the other end of the line. Gregory and I had played poker together every other Thursday for over a decade. But Gregory was not just an old friend with a good poker face. Before he retired, he spent 35 years as a senior forensic investigator for the Internal Revenue Service. He had dismantled complex corporate fraud rings and traced hidden money through digital labyrinths across the globe. He knew how to find things that were meant to stay buried. "William, you are calling from a burner," Gregory said, his tone instantly shifting from casual to tactical. "What kind of trouble are you in?" I took a deep breath, the cold air stinging my lungs. "Christopher drained my entire life savings this morning," I told him. $450,000 is gone. He claims it is in a domestic escrow account for a real estate transfer. I need you to prove he is lying. I need you to find my money." Gregory did not ask useless questions. He offered no empty sympathies. He simply gave me an address. "I will see you in 20 minutes, he said, and the line went dead. I walked briskly to the address Gregory had provided. It was a loud, anonymous, brightly lit diner located on the edge of the industrial district. The air inside smelled strongly of fried onions and old coffee. The clatter of plates and the loud chatter of the lunch crowd provided the perfect acoustic cover for a private conversation. I spotted Gregory sitting in a vinyl booth in the far back corner facing the entrance. He already had his heavy encrypted laptop open on the laminated table. I slid into the booth opposite him. I wasted no time with pleasantries. I gave him my banking details, my account numbers, and the exact time the wire transfer had been initiated. Gregory adjusted his thick framed glasses and began to type. His fingers moved across the keyboard with a rapid, practiced precision. For 10 agonizing minutes, the only sound between us was the clicking of the keys and the background noise of the diner. I watched his facial expressions closely, waiting for a sign. Finally, he just stopped typing. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, letting out a long, heavy breath. He turned the laptop screen toward me. "William," he said, his voice completely devoid of its usual warmth. "I am sorry. Christopher lied to you. This money never touched a domestic escrow account. It did not go to a local title company or a legitimate real estate firm." I stared at the complex lines of data highlighting the digital path of my stolen life savings. "Where did it go, Gregory?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper over the diner noise. Gregory tapped the screen with a heavy finger. He routed the entire balance through 3 different intermediate processors to mask the origin. But the final destination is a blind offshore shell account located in the Cayman Islands. The Cayman Islands. The words hung in the stale air of the diner. I stared at the glowing screen of Gregory's laptop, watching my life savings disappear into an untouchable offshore void. Christopher meticulously orchestrated a financial crime to ensure I never got it back. The shock morphed into cold anger. My son, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the man whose engineering tuition I had paid in full, had treated me like a mark in a corporate heist. But the money was only half of the equation. A terrifying question still burned in my mind. "Gregory," I said, leaning closer across the table, "the money explains the empty bank account. But what about the house? How does a man legally sell real estate in someone else's name?" I was not there. I never met with a real estate agent. I never sat down with a notary. I never signed a single piece of paper authorizing the transfer of my property. Gregory pushed his thick-framed glasses further up the bridge of his nose. His eyes were narrowed, entirely focused on the screen. "Let us find out," he murmured. "Give me the exact address of the property." I recited the address of the brick home I built for Catherine. Gregory opened a secure tab and bypassed digital gateways to access the county clerk's public property records. His fingers moved with lightning speed, pulling up deeds, property tax histories, and recent transactions. The diner around us continued its noisy lunch rush with plates clattering and waitresses calling out orders, but my entire universe reduced to the bright screen in front of me. "Got it," Gregory said. His voice was grim. He clicked a file and a scanned PDF of a legal document filled the screen. It was a deed of sale. It showed my property had been transferred and sold the previous morning. What caught my attention was the signature line at the bottom of the page. It did not have my signature, forged or otherwise. It had Christopher's signature. Below his heavily stylized cursive, a printed title read, "Acting as legal guardian and attorney in fact for William." My breath hitched. Legal guardian. I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "What does that mean? I am a fully independent adult. I manage my own pension. I drive my own car. He cannot just declare himself my legal guardian. He can if he has the right paperwork." Gregory replied, his tone growing dark. "Let me look at the attachments. The county clerk requires proof of guardianship to authorize a sale of this magnitude without the primary owner present." Gregory opened a secondary file uploaded alongside the property transfer. The header made the blood freeze in my veins. It was a durable medical and financial power of attorney. I recognized it immediately. It was the paperwork Christopher brought to my house 14 months ago, right after I experienced that minor dizzy spell. He told me it was a standard medical directive. He lied. He bound me in legal chains while smiling. "But a power of attorney is not enough to sell a house against the owner's will," Gregory explained, his eyes scanning the fine print. "Unless the primary owner is declared unfit to make their own decisions." He scrolled down to the final document in the file. "I need to see what triggered the activation clause." The third document appeared on the screen. It was printed on the official letterhead of a private medical clinic located on the other side of Chicago. I had never heard of the clinic. I had certainly never been a patient there. It was a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation and medical certificate. The signature at the bottom belonged to a physician I had never met. I leaned in, reading the clinical notes. The doctor claimed to have examined me extensively over 6 months. The report detailed aggressive mood swings, severe memory loss, and an inability to perform basic life functions. Then I read the final diagnostic conclusion. The doctor had declared me legally and permanently incapacitated. The official diagnosis printed on the county record was severe late-stage Alzheimer's disease. I sat back, feeling a nauseating wave of violation. This was not just theft. This was the premeditated destruction of my identity. Christopher bribed a corrupt physician to falsify my medical records. He legally assassinated my mind. In the eyes of the state, I was no longer a human being with rights or agency. I was a ghost. I was a ward of my son, completely at his mercy. He stripped me of my legal personhood just so he could sign the deed. "They took everything," I whispered, staring blindly at the coffee mug in my hands. "They took my money. They took my home. They took my mind." Gregory did not offer empty comfort. He was a man of facts, and the facts were telling a horrific story. But his investigation was not finished. He leaned closer to the screen, his brow furrowed in deep concentration. "William, look at this," Gregory said, his voice dropping an octave. He scrolled back to the first page, the deed of sale. "We know how he sold it. Now we need to look at who he sold it to." I forced myself to focus on the screen. The buyer listed on the deed was not a young family looking for a suburban home. It was a corporate entity. The name printed on the buyer's line was Caldwell Holdings Limited Liability Company. Caldwell. I repeated the name, tasting like ash in my mouth. "That is Stephanie's maiden name." Gregory nodded slowly, his fingers flying across the keyboard to run a corporate registry search on the company. "Give me a second. I am pulling the state business registration for Caldwell Holdings. We need to see who is listed as the managing director." A new window popped up on the laptop. It was a state tax document detailing the corporate structure of Caldwell Holdings. The managing director's name was printed clearly at the top. Richard Caldwell, Stephanie's father. I said, the horrific puzzle finally snapping into place. "Exactly," Gregory replied. "And look at the sale price, William. Look at what they declared to the county." I looked at the number. My house, which sat on a premium suburban lot and had a market value of $600,000, was sold to Caldwell Holdings for exactly $50,000. "He did not sell your house to a stranger," Gregory said, looking me directly in the eyes. "Your son and his future father-in-law orchestrated a fraudulent transaction. Christopher used a bribed doctor to declare you incompetent, activated a deceptive power of attorney, and gifted your property to Stephanie's father for pennies on the dollar." I sat in the loud diner, entirely insulated in a cold cocoon of betrayal. Stephanie's father bought my house for practically nothing. Christopher facilitated the theft of my entire life. They were all in this together. The wedding tomorrow was not a celebration of true love between two people starting a life together. It was a vile victory party completely funded by my total financial and personal ruin. I realized with a sickening clarity that settled deep within the marrow of my bones that every single smile, every warm hug, and every family dinner over the past year had been a carefully rehearsed performance leading directly to my complete, ultimate destruction. I sat in the crowded diner, the heavy smell of burnt coffee and fried food churning violently in my stomach. The revelation that Christopher had handed my beloved home over to Stephanie's father made absolutely no logical sense. I looked across the small table at Gregory, my mind working furiously to connect the fragmented, broken pieces of this horrific puzzle. Richard Caldwell was reputed to be a titan of commercial real estate. He was a man who supposedly owned luxury high-rises, sprawling corporate complexes, and vast residential developments across the entire Midwest region of the country. He was a verified billionaire, according to the lavish engagement party speeches and the glossy magazine features Christopher had proudly shown me just a few months ago. Why would a man with that level of astronomical, untouchable wealth need to steal a modest brick house in the quiet Chicago suburbs? My home was my absolute castle, but in the ruthless world of high finance, it was a meaningless drop in the ocean. It was a mundane asset that should not have even registered on a billionaire's radar. I voiced this exact question to Gregory. I leaned over the sticky laminated table, lowering my voice so the busy waitress walking past our booth with a heavy tray of dishes would not hear my words. Gregory did not answer immediately. He cracked his knuckles, a familiar, deliberate habit from our long poker nights when he was about to call a massive bluff. He shifted his encrypted laptop closer to his chest and opened a new, highly secure gateway on his browser. He told me that billionaires do not operate in the shadows for small change unless the shadows are the absolute only places left for them to hide. He began to run a deep, comprehensive forensic audit on Caldwell Holdings Limited Liability Company. He easily bypassed the glossy public relations websites and dug directly into the federal corporate filings, the hidden tax liens, and the mandated financial disclosures that most people never bother to look up. I watched the reflection of the rapidly scrolling text illuminate Gregory's face in the dim diner light. The deep lines around his mouth hardened into a rigid grimace of pure shock. The ambient noise of the busy diner seemed to fade away entirely as he pulled back the heavy curtain on Richard Caldwell's supposed empire. The reality he uncovered was a breathtaking, catastrophic illusion. William Gregory said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper that sent a shiver down my spine. Richard Caldwell is not a billionaire. He is not even a millionaire. He is a financial corpse walking, dragging his decaying empire behind him every single day. Gregory turned the laptop screen toward me so I could see the truth. He pointed a steady finger to a complex labyrinth of red numbers, default judgments, and severe delinquency notices. He explained that Caldwell's vast real estate empire had quietly collapsed 2 entire years ago during a massive commercial market downturn. Caldwell had severely over-leveraged his properties, borrowing heavily against empty office buildings that absolutely nobody wanted to rent. When the interest rates spiked, his entire fragile house of cards caved in on itself. According to the federal tax records flashing brightly on the screen, Richard Caldwell was currently drowning in exactly $15 million of toxic, unmanageable debt. He was facing multiple aggressive lawsuits from furious creditors and was on the absolute brink of a massive federal indictment for corporate fraud. The wealth, the luxury, the arrogant billionaire persona, it was all a desperate, meticulously crafted lie to keep the federal authorities and the remaining investors from realizing he was completely and totally bankrupt. The pieces of the nightmare finally clicked into perfect, terrifying alignment. I looked at the bright screen, understanding exactly how my peaceful life had been violently dismantled to feed their pathetic charade. Christopher had not just given my house to Caldwell as a simple gift to win his favor. They had used my stolen property as hard, unencumbered collateral to immediately secure a high-interest, $2 million predatory loan from an unregulated private shadow lender located entirely outside of the traditional banking system. This lender specialized in exploiting desperate situations, and they demanded ruthless terms that would guarantee a swift foreclosure. That $2 million was the emergency lifeline Caldwell desperately needed to stay afloat. The $450,000 Christopher had drained from my bank account that very morning went straight into the hidden offshore accounts of Caldwell's most immediate and aggressive creditors. It was a direct payoff to keep him out of a federal prison cell for just a few more months. And the wedding. The extravagant $500,000 wedding scheduled for tomorrow night was never about my son marrying the woman he supposedly loved. It was a highly orchestrated theatrical production. It was a desperate, calculated attempt to project an image of untouchable wealth and complete financial stability to the elite society of Chicago. They were using my stolen money to throw a massive masquerade ball, hoping to lure in new, unsuspecting, wealthy investors who would attend the lavish wedding and blindly believe Caldwell was still a financial titan. My own son was actively trading my survival to buy his way into a crumbling, bankrupt dynasty. A profound, sickening disgust washed over my entire body, leaving me feeling hollow and exhausted. Christopher had looked me directly in the eye, smiled warmly, and offered me a luxurious month-long vacation in Florida, while he actively fed me to the hungry wolves waiting in the shadows. He had used my deep paternal trust against me, weaponizing my love to blind me to his unimaginable treachery. I leaned back heavily against the cracked vinyl booth, taking a long, shaking breath to steady my racing heart. I was completely ready to ask Gregory exactly how we could package this devastating information, organize the overwhelming evidence, and take it straight to the local police department to demand an immediate arrest warrant for my own flesh and blood. But before I could even open my mouth to speak, I saw Gregory staring intently at a secondary query running quietly in the background of his computer screen. The search query was linked directly to my personal Social Security number. The color completely and instantly drained from Gregory's face, leaving his usually ruddy skin a pale, sickly ashen gray. He slowly looked up at me, his eyes wide with a profound, visceral terror I had never seen in him before. He reached out and placed a trembling hand on my arm. "William, my friend, he whispered, his voice shaking so badly he could barely form the terrible words. The house and the cash. That is definitely not the main prize for them in this deeply twisted and evil game at all. I stared across the diner table at Gregory. The ambient clatter of silverware and the low hum of conversations suddenly felt miles away. My friend's hands were completely steady as he reached out and turned the heavy laptop so the screen directly faced me. I braced myself, expecting to see more fraudulent real estate transfers or hidden bank accounts. Instead, I saw a document featuring the crisp official letterhead of a major national insurance conglomerate. The bold text across the top of the digital page read, "Term Life Insurance Policy." I scanned the complex lines of data, my eyes immediately drawn to the highlighted section Gregory had deliberately enlarged for me to see. The total benefit payout in the event of my death was exactly $4 million. The policy was incredibly new. It had been issued and fully approved just 3 weeks ago, right around the time Christopher started heavily insisting that he handle all my mail and personal finances to save me from the stress of daily chores. I felt the air leave my lungs in a sharp, painful rush. $4 million. It was an astronomical sum of money placed squarely on the shoulders of a 77-year-old retired structural engineer. I leaned closer to the bright screen, forcing my aging eyes to read the smaller print listed under the primary beneficiaries section. There were only 2 names printed on that line: Christopher and Stephanie. They were designated to receive a 50-50 split of the entire $4 million payout upon my passing. My mind raced back to the medical power of attorney and the forged psychiatric evaluation, declaring me legally incompetent with severe dementia. It all made a horrific, perfect sense now. An insurance company would never issue a massive $4 million life insurance policy on an elderly man without an extensive medical examination. Unless, of course, the legal guardian provided a completely fabricated medical profile crafted by a corrupt, heavily bribed physician to guarantee swift approval while ensuring I appeared to be in rapid, inevitable physical decline. This was not a financial safety net for a grieving family. This was a massive, calculated bounty placed directly on my head. My own flesh and blood had systematically stolen my home and my life savings to buy his way into a bankrupt billionaire's family. But that was only the down payment. To secure his ultimate position in their decaying empire, Christopher had essentially agreed to sell my actual life. To collect that $4 million and save Richard Caldwell from federal prison, I had to stop breathing. My hands shook violently as I reached into the inside pocket of my charcoal suit coat. I pulled out the crumpled piece of paper I had stolen from the wastebasket in Christopher's luxurious penthouse study just an hour ago. I carefully unfolded it and slid it across the sticky diner table toward Gregory. "Look at this," I whispered, my voice sounding like dry, cracked leaves. "This is the private transportation and admission form they gave me. They told me I was going to a beautiful, sunny wellness retreat in Florida for a month of luxury massages and relaxation. But this is the real destination." Gregory looked down at the dark blue Medical Cross logo and the bold black letters spelling out Oak Haven Terminal Care. His jaw clenched tight. He quickly pulled the laptop back toward him, opening a highly secure law enforcement database he still had backdoor access to from his days as a federal investigator. He typed the name of the facility into the search bar. The results populated the screen in less than 5 seconds. Gregory did not read the public marketing website. He bypassed the glossy photos of smiling nurses and clicked directly into the state health department's restricted incident reports. William Gregory said, his voice thick with a mixture of profound sadness and rising anger. "Oak Haven is not a hospital. It is a slaughterhouse for discarded seniors." He turned the screen back to me. The facility was currently under a massive, highly classified state investigation. The internal reports detailed horrific systemic elder abuse. Patients who were legally stripped of their rights through forced guardianships were dumped into locked, overcrowded psychiatric wards. They were heavily and illegally sedated to ensure absolute compliance and minimal staffing costs. The documents cited severe medical neglect, intentional malnutrition, and a disturbing lack of basic hygiene protocols. But the most terrifying statistic highlighted in bright red text was the facility's abnormally high mortality rate. Patients admitted to Oakhaven under severe dementia, diagnoses rarely survived past 6 months. The sheer calculated evil of their entire plot hit me with the devastating force of a wrecking ball. They were not simply stealing my money or tearing down the brick house I had built for Catherine. They were actively sending me to a literal death camp. They planned to throw me into a neglected, locked ward where I would be chemically restrained and forgotten by the outside world. Christopher knew exactly what kind of facility Oakhaven was. He chose it deliberately because of its terrifying mortality rate. He needed me to die quickly and quietly to trigger the payout of the $4 million life insurance policy. If I got into that private town car at 3 o'clock this afternoon, I would be driven straight into a nightmare from which I would never return. I would rot in a dark room stripped of my dignity and my legal personhood while my son and his new bride danced at their extravagant $500,000 wedding. He was trading my remaining years on this earth to fund a fake billionaire's desperate charade. My own child had placed a strict 6-month expiration date on my life to secure his new family's wealth. I sat in the diner, the heavy smell of fried food entirely forgotten, replaced by a cold, burning resolve. I looked at Gregory. The fear and confusion that had clouded my mind all morning completely evaporated. It was replaced by the rigid, unbreakable strength of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. I had spent 40 years ensuring that massive structures could withstand the most devastating storms. I knew how to find the weak points in any foundation. Christopher and Stephanie thought they had built a flawless, untouchable fortress of lies. They thought their stolen wealth and forged medical documents made them completely invincible. They believed they had permanently silenced me. But they had made one massive, catastrophic mistake. They had left me walking free with the truth in my hands. The wedding of the century was scheduled to take place tomorrow evening at the most prestigious hotel in the city. The entire elite society of Chicago would be gathered in one magnificent ballroom to witness the union of two incredibly wealthy dynasties. They were expecting a beautiful celebration funded by my financial ruin. Instead, I was going to give them a public execution. I would ensure they paid for every single drop of my stolen blood. I looked across the table at Gregory and nodded my head slowly in absolute agreement to completely dismantle their entire world. The diner clock above the kitchen counter read past 8. The dinner rush thinned out, leaving us in a quiet bubble. Gregory closed the health file and pulled up a digital calendar. He pointed a thick finger at the current date. It was Friday night. The lavish wedding was scheduled to begin tomorrow evening. But the most critical deadline was not the wedding. It was the movement of my stolen savings. Gregory explained the mechanics of money laundering. The $450,000 Christopher wired out of my account this morning was resting in a holding account in the Cayman Islands. Because international banking protocols pause over the weekend, the funds were frozen. However, the moment global financial markets opened on Monday morning, that money would be dispersed. It would be fragmented into dozens of untraceable cryptocurrency wallets and scattered across servers worldwide. Once that digital dispersion happened, my savings would be gone forever. It would be unrecoverable, buried behind encrypted anonymity. We had less than 24 hours to stop the transfer and expose their entire operation before the wedding legitimized Richard Caldwell's fake empire. I asked Gregory if we should go to the local police precinct right now. He shook his head firmly. Local law enforcement did not have the jurisdiction, resources, or speed to handle a complex international financial crime on a Friday night. A local desk sergeant would look at the forged medical power of attorney and call it a civil family dispute, advising me to file a petition in family court on Monday. By the time a judge glanced at my case, my money would be gone. My house would be demolished rubble, and I would be fighting a grueling legal battle from the locked psychiatric ward of Oakhaven Terminal Care. We needed immediate federal intervention. We needed someone with authority to freeze international assets and issue emergency warrants over the weekend. Gregory pulled out his encrypted mobile phone and dialed a number. He told me he was calling Agent Mitchell, a former investigative protege, currently working as a senior operative in the Financial Crimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. When the call connected, Gregory did not waste time with casual greetings. He spoke in sharp professional terms. He informed Mitchell he was sitting on a massive live wire fraud case involving a corporate scam, forged medical documents, and an active conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. He gave the agent the address of the diner and told him to get there immediately. Exactly 25 minutes later, the bell above the diner door jingled. A sharply dressed man in his late 30s walked through the entrance. He wore a dark tailored suit and possessed an intense, observant gaze that scanned the room before locking onto our corner booth. Agent Mitchell approached our table and slid into the vinyl seat next to Gregory. He offered me a firm, respectful handshake, introducing himself quietly so the remaining patrons would not overhear. Mitchell looked at my pale face, assessing my shock, and then turned his full attention to the laptop screen. We spent the next several hours turning the sticky diner booth into a makeshift federal command center. Mitchell brought a portable, secure, encrypted printer out from the trunk of his federal vehicle, plugging it directly into Gregory's laptop. As the night dragged on, we began to systematically print out the physical evidence of my planned destruction. The small printer hummed quietly, spitting out page after page of undeniable proof. We printed the detailed wire transfer logs routing my life savings to the offshore shell accounts controlled by Caldwell Holdings. We printed the fraudulent property deed, transferring the home I built for Catherine to Stephanie's father for pennies on the dollar. We printed the horrific, heavily forged psychiatric evaluation from the bribed doctor, the document that illegally stripped me of my cognitive autonomy. Finally, we printed the massive $4 million life insurance policy listing Christopher and Stephanie as the sole beneficiaries alongside the fast-tracked mandatory admission forms to Oakhaven Terminal Care. The pile of paper grew steadily on the table, forming a complete, terrifying blueprint of a cold-blooded corporate and familial assassination. Agent Mitchell carefully read through every single document as it came off the printer. With each passing page, his professional demeanor grew distinctly darker. He realized the sheer cruelty and massive scale of the crime being perpetrated against a trusting father. He looked at the admission forms for the abusive hospice facility and shook his head in absolute disgust. He told me that in his 15 years of investigating financial predators, weaponizing a parent's love to send them to a literal death camp was a level of depravity that warranted maximum federal prosecution. It was now well past midnight. The diner was completely empty except for a single cook cleaning the grill. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a low electrical hum. Agent Mitchell gathered the thick stack of printed evidence and tapped the edges neatly against the laminated table, aligning the pages into a perfect, undeniable federal case file. He slipped the documents into a secure leather binder and looked at Gregory, exchanging a silent, professional nod of confirmation. Then, the federal agent turned his intense gaze directly toward me. William Agent Mitchell said, his voice quiet, but echoing with absolute authority. This evidence is completely airtight. We have them dead to rights on multiple counts of federal wire fraud, identity theft, banking manipulation, and conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. We have everything we need to put your son, his fiancée, and Richard Caldwell behind bars for a very long time. I felt a wave of profound relief wash over my tired shoulders, but Mitchell raised his hand slightly, indicating that there was still a major tactical hurdle to overcome. However, Mitchell continued his tone, becoming highly strategic. The problem is the timeline and the targets. Richard Caldwell has extensive resources and a private jet. If we start freezing these offshore accounts tonight, his bankers will immediately alert him through automated alarms. The moment he realizes the federal authorities are tracing the money, he will panic. He will likely attempt to flee the country with Christopher and Stephanie before a judge can sign the physical arrest warrants on a Saturday. To execute this properly, we need a massive strategic advantage. We need to isolate them. We need all three conspirators in the exact same room, entirely distracted and completely unaware that we are onto them. We have to catch them celebrating their victory before we drop the hammer. A slow, determined, and deeply satisfying calm washed over my entire body as I looked at the federal agent. The lingering pain of my son's betrayal transformed into a solid block of protective steel within my chest. I knew exactly how to deliver them directly into the hands of federal law enforcement without them suspecting a thing. I leaned forward across the table, looking Agent Mitchell directly in the eyes. I know exactly where all three of them will be tomorrow night. The sun broke over the Chicago skyline, casting long, pale shadows across the empty diner parking lot as we finalized our tactical plan. I did not sleep a single wink that night. The intense adrenaline pumping through my veins had completely erased the heavy fatigue of my 77 years. When the morning finally arrived, I parted ways with Gregory and Agent Mitchell, knowing that we each had our specific critical roles to execute before the sun went down again. My first task was not a legal one, but a deeply personal necessity. I took a city bus to a small, unassuming bank branch located 3 towns over from my old neighborhood. Years ago, my late wife, Catherine, had insisted we keep a private safe deposit box for absolute emergencies. Inside that cold metal drawer was exactly $1,000 in crisp bills, money she had quietly set aside just in case the world ever fell apart. Today, the world had completely shattered, and I was going to use her final gift to piece myself back together. I took the cash and walked straight to an upscale men's tailor downtown, completely ignoring the luxurious boutiques where Christopher normally shopped. I found a traditional, highly respected shop owned by a master craftsman. I walked through the heavy wooden door in my wrinkled, worn clothes. I placed the $1,000 on the polished glass counter and told the tailor I needed a suit for a very important event tonight. I did not want something cheap off the rack. I needed a razor-sharp, custom-fit charcoal suit. I stood silently in front of the tall, 3-way mirrors as the tailor meticulously pinned and adjusted the heavy, expensive fabric to my frame. I watched the defeated, helpless victim my son had tried to create vanish with every careful stitch. I was going to end Christopher's life as he knew it, but I absolutely refused to do it, looking like a broken, pathetic old man. I was going to stand in that magnificent ballroom, looking like the proud, strong father who had raised him. I wanted him to look at me and recognize the formidable man he had foolishly decided to betray. While I stood perfectly still for the tailor, Agent Mitchell was actively orchestrating a massive, invisible federal dragnet across the entire city. Gregory kept me updated via encrypted text messages on the prepaid burner phone. Mitchell had wisely bypassed the local police department, entirely taking the mountain of printed evidence directly to a federal judge he trusted for emergency weekend authorizations. The judge had taken one single look at the forged medical certificates, the predatory real estate transfer, and the $4 million life insurance policy before immediately signing the necessary warrants. The real masterpiece of Mitchell's operation, however, was the sophisticated financial blockade. He coordinated directly with the International Cyber Division to intercept the wire transfers currently resting in the Cayman Islands. They did not simply block the accounts, which would have triggered an automatic alert to Richard Caldwell and given him ample time to flee the country. Instead, they placed the offshore accounts under a secret federal seal. It was a digital ghost protocol. To Caldwell and his corrupt offshore bankers, the millions of dollars still appeared to be sitting safely in the accounts, completely untouched and ready for dispersion on Monday morning. But in reality, the money was locked tightly in an impenetrable federal vault, completely inaccessible to anyone. The trap was set perfectly. The bait looked delicious, but the heavy steel jaws were already clamped shut, waiting for the greedy predators to step inside. The federal agents spent the rest of the afternoon quietly positioning themselves around the downtown area, preparing to move in on the designated target. They were meticulously dressing in expensive plain clothes, ensuring they would blend seamlessly into the sophisticated, high-wealth environment of the exclusive society event without raising any suspicion whatsoever. We had successfully isolated the conspirators. They were entirely distracted by the dazzling glamour of their own fake success, utterly blind to the massive legal hurricane that was rapidly gathering strength just outside their doors. By 5 o'clock in this evening, the tailor handed me the beautifully finished charcoal suit, enclosed in a protective garment bag. I changed in the back dressing room. When I stepped out, I barely recognized the reflection staring back at me. The dark suit fit flawlessly, sitting broad across my shoulders and sharply tailored at my waist. I looked incredibly powerful. I felt an icy, unbreakable resolve settle deep into the marrow of my bones. I thanked the tailor for his excellent work and walked out into the crisp, cooling evening air. At exactly 6 o'clock, I stood perfectly still in the heavy shadows of a towering oak tree directly across the street from the historic Grand Plaza Hotel. The autumn sun was quickly dipping below the city horizon, painting the sky in deep bruising shades of purple and dramatic red. The Grand Hotel was a towering beacon of excessive luxury, glowing warmly with golden light. A steady fleet of sleek, black limousines and expensive luxury sedans were continuously pulling up to the bustling valet stand. The absolute elite of Chicago society were stepping out of their polished vehicles. I watched elegant women in glittering designer gowns and wealthy men in immaculate tuxedos walking gracefully up the crimson-red carpet, laughing brightly and holding delicate glasses of complimentary champagne handed to them at the grand doors. They were entirely, blissfully unaware that the magnificent celebration they were attending was funded entirely by stolen blood money. They were cheerfully marching into a massive federal crime scene disguised cleverly as a fairy tale romance. I stood completely still, watching the heavy glass doors open and close with a smooth, rhythmic precision. I thought deeply about Catherine, our shared decades of honest labor, and how much her pure, loving heart would have absolutely hated the dark, insatiable greed that had entirely consumed the soul of our only child. I took a deep, steadying breath, letting the cold air fill my lungs, reminding myself that I was still alive and still fighting. I thought about the damp, neglected corridors of Oakhaven Terminal Care, the horrific, locked prison where I was supposed to be rotting away at this very moment. A sleek black federal SUV pulled up quietly to the corner of the busy block. Agent Mitchell stepped out, dressed impeccably in a sharp tuxedo that made him look like just another incredibly wealthy wedding guest. He caught my eye across the crowded street and gave me one single, slow, deliberate nod. The perimeter was completely secured. The trap was now fully operational. I reached up and slowly adjusted my dark silk tie, feeling the smooth, expensive fabric slide effortlessly between my fingers. The time for hiding in the cold shadows was permanently over forever. I stepped out of the darkness, left the safety of the concrete sidewalk, and began to cross the busy street toward the grand, brightly illuminated entrance of the hotel, ready to take back my stolen life and deliver absolute justice to my treacherous son. The evening air felt sharp against my face as I navigated through the labyrinth of idling luxury vehicles. Valets in crisp uniforms rushed past me, opening doors for men in tailored tuxedos and women dripping in expensive jewels. Nobody paid any attention to the elderly man in the charcoal suit, walking deliberately up the wide marble steps. To them, I was just another anonymous guest, arriving to celebrate the union of two incredibly affluent families. I pushed through the heavy revolving brass doors and entered the massive lobby. The immediate contrast between the chilly autumn air outside and the warm, perfumed atmosphere inside the hotel was jarring. The lobby buzzed with the low, sophisticated murmur of high society mingling. I paused for a brief moment near a towering marble pillar to scan the vast room. Agent Mitchell had assured me that his federal strike team was already in position, and he was absolutely right. I spotted at least 6 individuals standing near the primary exits and the secondary service doors who possessed the distinct alert posture of federal law enforcement. They were dressed in immaculate formal wear, holding delicate crystal flutes of sparkling water, but their eyes were constantly moving, analyzing every single person in the room. We exchanged no visible signs of recognition. The trap was perfectly laid, and the perimeter was completely secured. I took a deep breath, smoothing the lapels of my custom suit, and walked toward the grand ballroom where the primary reception was being held. The heavy mahogany double doors leading into the main reception area were propped wide open, flanked by smiling ushers handing out silver-embossed programs. I bypassed the greeting line, slipping quietly through the entrance and merging immediately into the deep shadows near the back wall of the cavernous room. The sheer scale of the visual extravagance before me was genuinely breathtaking. The ceiling was dominated by 3 massive crystal chandeliers that cast a warm, golden glow over hundreds of distinguished guests. Every single round table was draped in heavy silk linens and adorned with towering centerpieces, constructed entirely of imported white roses. The sweet, almost suffocating floral scent hung thick in the air, masking the absolute moral decay hiding just beneath the surface. On a raised platform in the corner, a highly professional string quartet played a seamless, elegant classical melody that provided a perfect auditory backdrop for the wealthy patrons. Waiters in immaculate white jackets glided effortlessly across the polished dance floor, balancing silver trays loaded with premium champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. It was a flawless, masterfully produced theatrical performance. Every single detail, from the ambient lighting to the custom menu, had been meticulously designed to project an aura of untouchable, limitless wealth. And I knew, with a sickening certainty, that every single crystal glass, every white rose, and every note played by the musicians had been paid for with my stolen life savings and the fraudulent mortgage secured against my home. They were drinking my retirement. They were dancing on the grave of my independence. I remained perfectly still in the dim lighting, near the heavy velvet drapes, allowing myself to observe the central architects of my attempted destruction. Near the front of the room, standing beside a towering ice sculpture, was Richard Caldwell. He was holding a glass of dark amber liquor, laughing loudly at a joke made by a prominent city alderman. Caldwell was playing the role of the triumphant billionaire tycoon with sickening perfection. He slapped other wealthy investors on the back, exuding a false confidence designed exclusively to lure their money into his collapsing, bankrupt empire. He looked completely unburdened, entirely unbothered by the $15 million of toxic debt threatening to send him to a federal penitentiary. He truly believed he had gotten away with it. He believed the old engineer was currently sitting heavily medicated in a locked psychiatric ward, securely out of sight and out of mind. Then my eyes drifted slightly to the right, and the cold knot in my chest pulled agonizingly tight. Stephanie was standing near the edge of the polished dance floor, surrounded by a circle of fawning bridesmaids. She was wearing a stunning custom-designed wedding gown that likely cost upwards of $30,000. But it was not the excessive dress that made my blood run absolutely cold. Resting delicately against her collarbone, catching the brilliant light of the crystal chandeliers above, was Catherine's diamond pendant. Seeing that sacred family heirloom draped around the neck of the woman who had happily signed my death warrant was a profound, visceral violation. She paraded my dead wife's memory around the room as a hollow status symbol entirely devoid of the honor and love that necklace was meant to represent. The sheer audacity of her displaying that stolen jewelry in front of hundreds of people solidified my resolve. I felt no pity. I felt absolutely no hesitation about what was going to happen next. I shifted my gaze to find the final conspirator. Christopher was navigating through the dense crowd, shaking hands and accepting warm congratulations from the elite guests. He wore a brilliantly tailored tuxedo, looking every inch the successful rising young executive he desperately pretended to be. He moved with a practiced, arrogant grace completely insulated by his own deep delusion. He truly believed he had secured his ultimate future by happily sacrificing his father. I watched him slowly approach the main stage at the front of the grand ballroom. As he stepped up onto the elevated platform, he signaled gracefully to the string quartet. The musicians smoothly brought their elegant performance to a quiet, graceful close. The sudden shift in the ambient sound immediately drew the undivided attention of the sprawling room. Joyful conversations gradually faded into a highly respectful silence as hundreds of wealthy guests turned their faces toward the handsome groom. Christopher stepped up to the polished silver microphone stand, positioned squarely in the center of the large stage. He reached out and confidently took a fresh glass of Dom Perignon champagne from a passing waiter. He tapped a small silver spoon gently against the fine crystal rim, ensuring he had the absolute attention of every single person in the room. He cleared his throat, adjusting his broad shoulders to project a somber, deeply emotional vulnerability to the waiting audience. The silence in the massive room became completely absolute as everyone waited for his words. "I want to welcome you all, and I want to dedicate this very first toast," Christopher said, his voice echoing loudly through the massive speakers, thick with a perfectly manufactured, heartbreaking sorrow to my father, William. He is terribly ill and battling severe cognitive decline. He could not be here with us tonight to celebrate, but his immense generosity and his unconditional love made this entire beautiful evening possible. A soft wave of polite, respectful applause washed over the magnificent ballroom. Guests raised their crystal flutes into the air, completely moved by the touching tribute of a devoted son honoring his absent father. Stephanie reached up with a delicate, manicured hand and wiped a perfectly manufactured tear from her cheek. It was a flawless performance. It was a masterpiece of deceit, designed to secure the absolute trust of every wealthy investor standing in that room. I listened to the clapping echo against the soaring frescoed ceiling. The sheer hypocrisy of the moment burned through my chest, burning away any remaining trace of hesitation or paternal pity. I took one final deep breath of the heavy rose-scented air. I stepped out from the concealment of the velvet drapes and walked directly into the blinding glow of the crystal chandeliers. The main aisle of this ballroom was a wide pathway covered by a thick, pristine white carpet that stretched all the way from the grand entrance to the elevated stage. I placed my black leather shoes squarely on that carpet and began to walk. I did not rush. I did not run. I moved with the slow, deliberate, and heavy cadence of an engineer inspecting a bridge that was about to collapse. The first few tables near the back of the room did not notice me. The guests were entirely focused on Christopher at the front. But as I moved further down the center aisle, passing the massive floral centerpieces and the glowing candles, the atmosphere in the room began to shift rapidly. A prominent socialite seated at a table on my right lowered her champagne glass, her eyes widening in confusion. A wealthy banker on my left paused mid-sentence, turning his head to stare at the elderly man in the tailored charcoal suit, marching toward the wedding party. The polite, scattered applause began to falter, dying out in confused, uneven patches. A low murmur started near the back doors and quickly rippled forward like a sudden wave crashing against a quiet shore. The guests began whispering to one another, leaning across their silk-draped tables to ask who the stern, unsmiling stranger interrupting the toast could possibly be. I kept my eyes locked firmly on the stage. I ignored the gasps and the murmurs. I felt the immense weight of 500 pairs of Zhao eyes turning to look at me, but I did not break my stride. I was not there for them. I was there for the three people standing on that elevated platform. Christopher was still holding the silver microphone, smiling warmly at the front row, completely soaking in the admiration of the elite crowd. He raised his glass to take a victorious sip of the expensive vintage champagne. As he lowered the crystal flute, his eyes scanned down the center aisle. I was exactly 30 feet away when he finally saw me. The transformation of his face was instantaneous and absolutely horrifying to witness. The warm, confident smile froze, twisting into a grotesque mask of pure, unadulterated terror. All the blood completely drained from his face in a single second, leaving his skin the color of wet ash. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. The muscles in his hand went completely slack. The delicate crystal champagne flute slipped right through his paralyzed fingers. It hit the polished wooden floor of the stage with a sharp, violent crack that echoed loudly through the sensitive microphone. The sharp sound of shattering glass made the entire ballroom flinch. Stephanie spun around, startled by the sudden noise. She followed Christopher's terrified gaze down the white carpet. When her eyes locked onto me, she physically recoiled. She took 3 rapid, stumbling steps backward, her high heels catching on the heavy fabric of her $30,000 wedding gown. She bumped hard against the string quartet's wooden music stands, clutching her chest. Her manicured hand desperately grabbed the stolen diamond pendant resting against her collarbone, as if trying to hide the physical evidence of her crime from my view. The musicians gasped, grabbing their cellos and violins to steady them. The entire room fell into a deathly, suffocating silence. The elegant facade was cracking wide open, exposing the absolute panic hiding underneath. I reached the bottom of the wooden stairs leading up to the stage. I did not pause. I placed my foot on the first step and began to climb. Each heavy footstep resonated with a quiet, undeniable authority. I was invading their sanctuary. I was breaching the walls of the golden cage they had built with my stolen life savings. As I reached the top of the platform, Christopher finally broke his paralysis. He lunged forward in a blind panic. He placed his body between me and the crowd, his broad shoulders shielding the microphone. He reached out and grabbed my arm, his fingers digging painfully into the fine wool of my custom charcoal suit. He was trembling so violently that I could feel the vibrations traveling up my sleeve. "Dad, what are you doing here?" he hissed. His voice was a frantic, desperate whisper meant only for my ears. "You are supposed to be at the facility. The driver sent a message saying he picked you up. How did you get out? You have to leave right now before you ruin everything." I looked at the boy I had raised. I looked at the man who had bribed a corrupt doctor to erase my mind, who had sold the house his mother loved, and who had gleefully scheduled my death to collect $4 million. I felt absolutely no pity for him. The paternal love that had blinded me for so many months was completely dead, replaced by absolute ice in my veins. I did not argue with him. I did not yell. I simply raised my right hand, grabbed his wrist, and squeezed it with the terrifying strength of a man who had spent 40 years working with heavy steel and concrete. Christopher gasped in pain, his grip instantly releasing my jacket. I stepped around him, grabbed the silver microphone stand, and pried his trembling fingers off the stem. He stumbled backward, completely defeated by the cold, silent fury radiating from my eyes. I turned slowly and faced the 500 wealthy guests staring up at the stage. From the front row, Richard Caldwell realized his fraudulent empire was on the verge of total collapse. The fake billionaire leaped from his chair, his face flushed dark red with violent rage. He pointed a shaking finger directly at me and screamed at the top of his lungs, "Security! Get that crazy old man out of here right now! Throw him out into the street!" 4 massive guards in dark suits instantly surged forward, rushing aggressively toward the wooden stairs. But before they could reach the first step, a figure moved swiftly from the center aisle. Agent Mitchell stepped out of the stunned crowd, intercepting the lead guard. He reached into the pocket of his tuxedo jacket and held up a gold FBI badge, letting the light catch the federal seal. "Nobody touches him," Mitchell commanded. I stood perfectly still behind the polished silver microphone stand, letting the last echoing syllable of his treacherous lie fade into the cavernous, frescoed ceiling. The massive ballroom was so profoundly silent that I could hear the faint, nervous rustle of silk gowns and the sharp intake of breath from the bridesmaids standing just a few feet away. I gripped the cool metal of the microphone with both hands. I did not adjust the height. Christopher and I were exactly the same height, a physical trait he had inherited from me along with his ruthless ambition. I looked out over the sea of 500 expectant faces. These were the titans of Chicago society. Influential investors, prominent politicians, and wealthy socialites, all waiting for a heartwarming story from a devoted elderly father who had supposedly battled through severe illness just to witness his only child get married. I was not going to give them a heartwarming story. I was going to give them a financial autopsy. I leaned slightly forward, keeping my posture rigidly straight. I did not yell. I did not let a single ounce of uncontrolled anger bleed into my delivery. My voice came through the towering speakers, steady, resonant, and entirely devoid of mercy. My son is absolutely right, I told the captivated crowd. My immense generosity did make this entire beautiful evening possible. A few polite, confused smiles flickered across the faces in the front row, assuming I was simply agreeing with Christopher's touching sentiment. But those smiles vanished instantly as I continued. My generosity made this possible, I stated, allowing the cold truth to anchor every word, because yesterday morning my son forged comprehensive medical documents declaring me legally and permanently mentally incompetent. He used those fraudulent papers to empty my bank accounts, stealing my $450,000 life savings. And if that was not enough, he then illegally sold my home of 30 years directly to his new father-in-law. The collective gasp that erupted from the ballroom sounded like all the oxygen had been suddenly violently sucked out of the room. Women covered their mouths in horror. Men shifted uncomfortably in their tailored tuxedos, exchanging bewildered, alarmed glances. Behind me, I could hear Christopher breathing heavily, a panicked, wet sound as his perfectly constructed world began to fracture. "He is lying!" Christopher suddenly shouted, his voice cracking with desperate, high-pitched hysteria. He lunged toward the microphone, but Agent Mitchell, standing just below the stage, took one menacing step forward, silently warning him to stay back. "He is severely sick. He has dementia. He does not know what he is saying. Someone get a doctor." I ignored his pathetic, flailing attempt to maintain the illusion. I simply raised my left hand and gave a sharp, deliberate nod toward the elevated audiovisual booth at the back of the room. Gregory was sitting in the shadows, behind the soundboard, waiting for my exact cue. He pressed a single key on his encrypted laptop. The massive high-definition projector screen, hanging directly behind the wedding party, flashed brilliantly to life, bathing the entire stage in a harsh, glaring white light. The first image illuminated on the screen was massive and undeniable. On the left side was the heavily forged psychiatric evaluation, clearly showing the fake signature of the bribed doctor and the devastating diagnosis of late-stage Alzheimer's disease. On the right side, blown up to 10 times its normal size, was a screenshot of my primary banking dashboard. It displayed a completed wire transfer for $450,000, leaving a glaring, undeniable balance of $0.00. The visual proof was absolute. The crowd stared at the screen, reading the documents with a growing, horrified fascination. The whispering mutated into a loud, frantic hum of disbelief and mounting disgust. I did not give them time to recover from the initial shock. I turned my head and locked my eyes directly onto Richard Caldwell. The man who had spent the entire evening confidently playing the role of an untouchable billionaire tycoon was currently gripping the edge of his table so hard his knuckles were stark white. Sweat rolled down his temple, completely ruining his composed, arrogant facade. Richard Caldwell. I continued, ensuring the microphone caught the dangerous, sharp edge in my voice. Used my stolen mortgage-free home to immediately secure a high-interest predatory loan. He needed my property as hard collateral because his own vast commercial real estate empire is completely and totally bankrupt. The moment I spoke the word bankrupt, a shockwave ripped through the elite audience. Several prominent investors seated near the front men, who had likely been considering handing Caldwell their money later that evening, physically recoiled in their chairs. I nodded to the back booth again. The projector screen instantly switched. The forged medical documents vanished, replaced by a massive, highly detailed spread of Caldwell Holdings' official federal tax filings and default judgments. The number $15 million glowed in bright red digital ink across the screen, representing the massive toxic mountain of debt Caldwell was desperately trying to outrun. My life savings were entirely drained to pay off his most immediate, aggressive creditors, I announced to the silent, horrified room. This extravagant $500,000 wedding you are all enjoying tonight is nothing but a desperate, fraudulent masquerade designed to trick new investors into saving him from a federal prison cell. I watched as a highly respected bank executive seated at table 4 stood up abruptly, threw his napkin onto his plate, and walked briskly out of the ballroom without looking back. 2 more couples followed him, their faces pale with disgust. Caldwell's financial reputation was completely disintegrating before his very eyes. He was ruined in the only circles that mattered to him. I looked back at Christopher and Stephanie, who were now standing frozen near the string quartet, looking like terrified animals caught in the blinding headlights of an oncoming train. I had exposed their theft. I had humiliated them in front of the most powerful people in the city. I had dismantled the fake billionaire's empire piece by piece. But I knew the financial devastation was merely the preamble to the true horror. I let the heavy, suffocating silence stretch out for 5 agonizing seconds. I wanted them to feel the absolute gravity of the trap closing around them. I watched Christopher visibly shake with cold fear, his perfect tuxedo now feeling like a heavy, suffocating prison uniform. The room hung entirely on my next words, completely paralyzed by the unfolding drama of a dynasty collapsing in real time. I leaned slightly closer to the silver microphone, deliberately dropping my voice to a dark, dangerous whisper that carried perfectly through the vast, breathless room. But the stolen money and the fraudulent real estate transfer simply were not enough for them at all, I said softly, into the absolutely quiet and terrified hall, watching them tremble. They desperately needed a much bigger and faster financial payout to truly secure their golden future together. They desperately needed to spill even more of my own blood. I turned my head slightly, catching Gregory's eye through the tinted glass of the audiovisual booth at the back. I gave him one final, barely perceptible nod. The massive high-definition projector screen behind us flickered before the financial ruin of Caldwell Holdings was completely wiped away. A nervous murmur rippled through the wealthy guests as a new set of documents appeared in stark clarity. On the left side of the screen was the crisp header of a major national insurance conglomerate. It was a completely authentic, recently finalized term life insurance policy. The bold black numbers printed under the total benefit payout section were so large they could be read perfectly from the very back row of the hall. $4 million. And listed squarely under the primary beneficiaries section were 2 names, Christopher and Stephanie. I allowed the sheer magnitude of that number to fully saturate the tense atmosphere of the room. I watched as the prominent bankers, socialites, and politicians squinted at the bright screen, their minds rapidly attempting to calculate why a bankrupt family would suddenly take out a massive life insurance policy on a healthy 77-year-old structural engineer. I gripped the silver microphone stand tighter, grounding myself against the rising tide of absolute disgust deep in my stomach. A life insurance policy of this magnitude is never issued on a man of my age without a pristine medical evaluation, I announced, my voice carrying a cold, devastating authority. Unless, of course, the legal guardian intentionally provides a fabricated psychiatric profile demonstrating that the insured party is in a rapid terminal cognitive decline. As I spoke those exact words, the right side of the projector screen illuminated to reveal the final, most terrifying piece of evidence. It was the fast-tracked mandatory admission form. The dark blue Medical Cross logo sat prominently above the facility's name, Oakhaven Terminal Care. A fresh wave of gasps erupted from the audience. Several guests who were local to the city recognized the name immediately. Oakhaven was not a wellness retreat. It was a notoriously abusive, locked psychiatric hospice that was currently under a massive, highly classified state investigation for severe medical neglect and an abnormally high mortality rate. Patients who entered those locked wards simply did not survive. I looked directly into the terrified, pale faces of the elite crowd standing before me. My son and his beautiful bride planned to lock me in a notorious hospice facility to die just so they could cash out a $4 million insurance policy, I said, driving every single word into the silent room like a heavy steel nail. They planned to throw me into a neglected locked ward where I would be chemically restrained and entirely forgotten by the outside world. They placed a strict 6-month expiration date on my life, knowing I would not survive the horrific conditions simply to ensure a massive financial payout could save their decaying empire. The ballroom instantly erupted into absolute uncontrolled chaos. The fragile, elegant facade of the high society wedding completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Guests began standing up from their silk-draped tables, their faces twisted into masks of profound, visceral horror. An alderman in the front row pushed his chair backward, knocking his expensive champagne flute onto the carpeted floor to get away from the stage. The disgust radiating from the audience was palpable, a heavy, suffocating wave of moral revulsion, directed entirely at the bride and groom. Near the edge of the polished dance floor, the tightly knit circle of fawning bridesmaids finally broke. The young women dressed in matching designer gowns stared at Stephanie with wide, terrified eyes. They began to step away from her, physically retreating, in genuine disgust, leaving the bride standing completely isolated in her $30,000 dress. Stephanie reached out to grab her maid of honor's arm, but the woman snatched her hand away, as if she had been burned. The total social annihilation they had feared above all else was unfolding rapidly in real time. They were no longer the golden couple of Chicago society. They were exposed predators, stripped of their false wealth, and laid bare before the very people they had desperately tried to impress. The sheer weight of the absolute public humiliation finally broke Christopher. His knees simply gave out beneath him. He collapsed heavily onto the polished wooden floor of the elevated stage, the sharp impact tearing the fabric of his expensive, tailored tuxedo trousers. He scrambled forward on his hands and knees, completely abandoning any remaining shred of his fabricated dignity. He reached out with trembling, sweaty hands and desperately grabbed the fabric of my pant leg. "Dad, please," Christopher sobbed, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched wail that echoed terribly through the quiet areas of the chaotic room. "You have to believe me. It was Richard's idea. He forced us to do it. He said we would lose everything if we did not get the insurance money. I never wanted to hurt you. I swear to God he made us sign those papers." The moment the cowardly accusation left his lips, Stephanie lost whatever tiny fraction of composure she had left. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She spun around, her expensive veil tangling around her shoulders, and glared at the man she was supposed to marry. "You idiot, shut up!" Stephanie screamed, her shrill voice cutting violently through the heavy murmur of the panicked crowd. She lifted the massive, expensive bouquet of white roses she had been clutching all evening and hurled it directly at Christopher's head. The flowers struck him across the face, scattering bruised white petals and thorny stems all over the stage. "You are ruining everything. Do not say another word to him." Richard Caldwell, standing just a few feet away, looked like he was about to experience a massive cardiac event. He lunged toward his daughter, his hands raised in a desperate, futile attempt to silence the public confessions pouring out of their mouths. But the damage was permanently, irreversibly done. They had turned on each other the very second their fragile, stolen empire began to burn, proving that their entire relationship was built entirely on a foundation of toxic, consuming greed. I did not step away from Christopher. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the weeping, pathetic man clutching my leg. I felt absolutely no warmth, no hesitation, and no paternal instinct to offer him even a fraction of comfort. The betrayal he had orchestrated was too deep, too thoroughly calculated, and too unforgivably cruel to ever be repaired. I looked at his tear-stained face, feeling a profound, quiet liberation settling deeply into my soul. I reached down, firmly grasped his trembling wrists, and physically peeled his sweating fingers off my custom charcoal suit. I dropped his hands back onto the wooden floor. "A man who sells his father's life for a party is absolutely no son of mine," I said, looking down at him with a heart completely free of any lingering regret. I turned around and nodded quietly to Agent Mitchell to finally finish it. The nod to Agent Mitchell was the silent signal that brought the illusion crashing down. Mitchell raised his hand, gesturing toward the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom. The response was instantaneous. The doors burst open and a swarm of federal agents flooded into the opulent space. Some wore sharp suits blending with the terrified wedding guests, while others wore tactical windbreakers. They moved with practiced efficiency, forming a tight perimeter around the elevated stage before anyone could fully comprehend what was happening. The sheer scale of the federal intervention sent panic through the elite crowd. Investors and socialites scrambled backward, pushing their silk chairs out of the way. The romantic string quartet music had died, replaced by the heavy thud of tactical boots marching across the hardwood floor. The air, thick with the scent of white roses and vintage champagne, now crackled with the undeniable electricity of impending justice. Richard Caldwell was the first to react. Realizing his massive web of corporate fraud had unraveled, he made a desperate attempt to escape. He shoved past a terrified bridesmaid, knocking a crystal floral arrangement to the ground, and sprinted toward a service exit. He did not make it 10 feet. 2 federal agents intercepted him, grabbing his tailored suit jacket and throwing him against a banquet table. Silverware and glasses shattered as they pinned him face down. "Get your hands off me," Caldwell screamed, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson as he struggled helplessly against the overwhelming physical force. "Do you have any idea who I am? Demand to speak to my attorneys right now. You are going to lose your badges for this." The agents ignored his frantic, arrogant threats. They efficiently wrenched his arms behind his back, and the sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoed loudly over his shouts. On the stage, the scene was even more chaotic. Christopher remained exactly where I had dropped his hands, kneeling on the scuffed wooden floor, staring blankly at the federal agents swarming up the steps. He offered absolutely no physical resistance. The profound shock of his total public ruin had paralyzed him. An agent grabbed his shoulder, hauling him roughly to his feet, and twisted his arms behind his back. Christopher winced as cold iron cuffs were securely fastened over the pristine, tailored cuffs of his custom tuxedo shirt. He looked entirely broken, a hollow shell of the arrogant man who had proudly stood at the microphone just 10 minutes ago. He did not look at me. He simply stared at the floor, tears streaming silently down his pale face. Stephanie, however, did not surrender quietly. The bride was completely unhinged by the sudden destruction of her luxurious fairy tale. As 2 female agents approached her, she began to scream hysterically, thrashing her arms and violently kicking her expensive designer heels against the stage floor. She fought with a desperate feral energy, refusing to accept that her stolen wealthy future was vanishing before her eyes. "Do not touch me," Stephanie shrieked, her voice echoing terribly across the vast, stunned ballroom. "You are ruining my wedding. Get away from me. I did not do anything wrong. It was all him. It was Christopher." The agents were entirely unmoved by her frantic performance. They expertly grabbed her flailing wrists, twisting them firmly behind her back. Stephanie continued to sob and scream, her perfect makeup completely ruined by a flood of dark tears. The sharp, unforgiving steel of the federal handcuffs closed tightly over the delicate $30,000 lace sleeves of her custom wedding gown. The visual contrast between the ultimate symbol of bridal purity and the cold reality of criminal iron was stark and deeply poetic. Agent Mitchell stepped forward, placing himself directly in the center of the stage. He projected his voice loud and clear, ensuring that every single word carried over the panicked murmuring of the stunned crowd. "Christopher, Stephanie, and Richard Caldwell." Mitchell announced, his tone ringing with absolute legal authority. "You are all under arrest for federal wire fraud, conspiracy to commit identity theft, bank fraud, and conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Do you understand these rights as I have read them to you?" The Miranda rights hung heavily in the air, cementing the absolute finality of their downfall. None of the conspirators answered him. Caldwell continued to curse into the tablecloth. Christopher wept silently, and Stephanie wailed against the grip of the female agents. Before the officers could march the bride down the stairs, I took one deliberate step forward. I raised my hand, signaling the 2 agents holding Stephanie to wait for just a single moment. They paused respectfully, giving me the space I needed. Stephanie looked up at me, her chest heaving with desperate, ragged sobs. "William, please," she begged, her voice cracking. "You have to tell them to stop. I am going to be your daughter. We are family." I looked at her tear-stained face, feeling an overwhelming sense of calm clarity. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I reached out slowly and calmly. I slipped my fingers gently behind her neck, locating the delicate gold clasp of the diamond pendant. I unhooked it with a fluid, practiced motion, letting the heavy, brilliant jewel slide smoothly off her skin. I held the necklace in the palm of my hand, feeling the familiar weight of Catherine's memory. I carefully folded my fingers over the diamonds and slipped the heirloom safely into the breast pocket of my charcoal suit. "This belongs to a woman of honor," I said, looking her directly in her terrified, pleading eyes. "You have not earned the right to look at it." I stepped back, entirely severing my final connection to the woman who had happily planned to trade my life for a luxurious vacation. I nodded to the agents, giving them the silent clearance to remove the criminals from my presence. The federal officers began to march the three conspirators down the stairs of the stage. The massive, shocked crowd of elite society guests parted, creating a judgmental pathway down the center of the ballroom. Christopher, Stephanie, and Richard Caldwell were paraded like common criminals down their own triumphant runway. Everyone watched them in absolute, pure disgust. As they marched toward the grand mahogany doors at the far end of the room, the heavy, opulent atmosphere of the Plaza Hotel was pierced by a sudden, jarring visual. Through the towering, ornate stained glass windows near the main entrance, the frantic strobing flashes of bright red and brilliant blue police lights began to violently illuminate the dark ballroom. The rhythmic, pulsing colors cut through the soft, golden glow of the crystal chandeliers, painting the terrified faces of the arrested conspirators in the harsh, unforgiving neon tones of immediate justice. The heavy doors swung shut, sealing their fate. Inside the grand ballroom, the immediate aftermath of the arrests unfolded with a frantic, silent urgency. The elite society of Chicago people, who had spent their entire lives cultivating an image of perfect poise and untouchable grace, completely abandoned their sophisticated manners. They scrambled to leave the tainted room as quickly as physically possible. There was no polite mingling, no graceful goodbyes, and absolutely no lingering to dissect the horrific drama they had just witnessed. They simply wanted to escape the blast radius of Richard Caldwell's completely shattered empire. I stood motionless on the elevated stage, my hands resting loosely at my sides, watching the rapid exodus of the city's wealthiest citizens. Wealthy investors and prominent politicians hurried down the wide center aisle, their heads bowed and their eyes fixed firmly on the white carpet. Not a single person dared to make eye contact with me. They were deeply terrified that looking at the man who had just dismantled a billionaire might somehow associate them with the radioactive scandal. Women in silk gowns gathered their skirts, running past the centerpieces. Men abandoned their tailored suit jackets on the backs of their chairs, too eager to flee to bother retrieving them. Within exactly 20 minutes, the sprawling, magnificent ballroom was completely empty. The transformation was haunting. What was supposed to be the most luxurious celebration of the decade had been reduced to a beautifully decorated graveyard. The hundreds of circular tables were left in a state of chaotic abandonment. Plates of expensive filet mignon sat cooling under the warm glow of the chandeliers. Crystal champagne flutes, some still bubbling with vintage Dom Perignon, were scattered haphazardly across the silk linens. The towering ice sculpture near the front of the room, carved to resemble two intertwined swans, had begun to melt rapidly, dripping a steady, rhythmic puddle of water onto the polished hardwood floor. The sheer scale of the waste was staggering, a perfect physical manifestation of the hollow, rotting core of my son's stolen dream. The silence was heavy and absolute. The string quartet had quietly packed their expensive instruments and slipped out through a rear service door long before the last guest departed. I remained standing entirely alone on the wooden stage, staring out at the empty chairs and the ruined white roses scattered across the floor, where Stephanie had violently thrown her bouquet. The deep, agonizing silence felt like a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. I heard the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps approaching from the back of the room. I turned my head slightly and watched Gregory walking down the center aisle. He moved past the abandoned tables with a calm, measured pace, navigating the debris of the ruined wedding, with the casual demeanor of a man who had seen countless empires collapse throughout his long career in federal investigations. He climbed the short wooden stairs to the stage and stopped beside me. He did not offer a celebratory smile or a triumphant slap on the back. He understood the profound, devastating gravity of what had just transpired. Gregory handed me a glass of cold water. I took it with a trembling hand, realizing for the first time how incredibly dry my throat had become. I took a long, slow sip, letting the cool liquid soothe the raw ache in my chest. "It is done," William Gregory said, his voice quiet, but echoing slightly in the vast, empty space. "Agent Mitchell just sent the confirmation from the command center. The offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands are completely frozen under federal seal. The money is safe. The fraudulent property deed has been flagged for immediate federal review, and the predatory loan secured by Richard Caldwell has been officially nullified. You will have your brick house and your entire life savings completely returned to you by Wednesday afternoon." I nodded slowly, staring down at the clear water in my glass. The logistical victory was absolute. The incredible towering wave of adrenaline that had fueled my actions over the past 24 hours finally began to recede, draining rapidly from my 77-year-old bones. In its absence, a profound, hollow ache settled deep into my chest. I felt a sudden, crushing physical exhaustion threaten to pull me down to the floor. I reached out and gripped the edge of the wooden podium to steady my shaking legs. I had won the battle. I had successfully navigated a treacherous labyrinth of corporate fraud, exposed a bribed medical professional, and saved my own life from a horrific, locked psychiatric ward. I had utterly destroyed the conspirators who sought to erase my existence for their own financial gain. But as I looked at the shattered crystal on the stage and the crushed white petals under my shoes, the devastating reality of my victory washed over me. I had saved my money and my home, but I had irreversibly lost my only child. The boy who used to sit on my shoulders and point at the passing airplanes, the teenager I had proudly sent to engineering school, the man I thought would carry my legacy forward, was completely gone. He had not just died. He had morphed into a cruel, unrecognizable predator, willing to sell his father's final years on Earth for a seat at a fraudulent billionaire's table. The grief was not the sharp, piercing agony I had felt when Catherine passed away. This grief was a dark, suffocating void. It was the mourning of a person who was still breathing, but completely dead to me. Gregory placed a heavy, comforting hand on my shoulder, offering silent solidarity. He knew there were absolutely no words that could heal the catastrophic wound my son had inflicted. I set the glass down on the podium. I took a final long look around the deserted ballroom, cementing the image of the ruined celebration in my memory. I turned away from the stage, walking slowly down the wooden steps and onto the white carpet of the center aisle. Gregory walked quietly beside me, matching my slow, measured pace. We pushed through the heavy mahogany doors, crossed the vast empty hotel lobby, and stepped out through the front entrance. The cool Chicago night air hit my face, carrying the faint scent of the lake. The flashing police lights were gone. The chaotic fleet of luxury limousines had vanished. The street was quiet, returning to its normal, steady rhythm. I stood on the pavement and took a deep, cleansing breath. The suffocating weight of the betrayal and the fear of the terminal care facility lifted entirely from my shoulders. I did not feel like a helpless victim anymore. I felt like a survivor who had been forced to perform a brutal, agonizing surgery on his own life. I had amputated a gangrenous, toxic limb to save the rest of the healthy body from completely rotting away. The loss was permanent, and the phantom pain would likely echo in my heart for the rest of my days. But the infection was gone. I was alive, I was free, and I was in absolute, unquestionable control of my own destiny. 6 months have passed since that cool Chicago night. The autumn winds have long since surrendered to the vibrant, blooming warmth of spring. The massive, highly publicized federal trial of Christopher Stephanie and Richard Caldwell, dominated the local news cycles for weeks. The mountain of irrefutable evidence Gregory and Agent Mitchell had meticulously compiled left the defense attorneys with absolutely no room to maneuver. When faced with the terrifying reality of a federal penitentiary, their fragile alliance instantly crumbled. They turned on each other with a vicious, desperate cruelty, each trying to secure a lighter sentence by shifting the blame. It did not work. The federal judge was entirely unswayed by their frantic, tearful apologies. Christopher, Stephanie, and Richard are currently facing 15 to 20 years in federal prison for conspiracy, severe elder abuse, and wire fraud. They traded a lifetime of freedom for a temporary illusion of wealth, and now they will spend the next 2 decades paying the ultimate price for their boundless greed. The legal restoration of my own life was swift and absolute, thanks to the secret federal seal placed on the offshore accounts. My entire $450,000 life savings was successfully recovered and safely deposited back into a secure, heavily monitored domestic account. The fraudulent property deed transferring my property to Caldwell Holdings was officially nullified by the state court. I got my solid brick house back. The antique grandfather clock and all of Catherine's beautiful furniture were safely retrieved from the downtown storage lockup and carefully placed exactly where they belonged. However, returning to my quiet, empty house did not bring the simple, peaceful retirement I had originally envisioned. The chilling, horrific reality of Oakhaven terminal care continuously haunted my waking thoughts. I could not stop thinking about the heavy locked doors of that psychiatric ward. I realized with a deep, unsettling clarity just how incredibly lucky I had been. I possessed an analytical engineering mind, and I happened to have a close personal friend with elite federal forensic connections. I had the unique resources necessary to fight back and dismantle the trap before it snapped shut. But I knew there were thousands of vulnerable seniors across the country who did not have those advantages. There were countless elderly men and women currently trapped in abusive facilities or having their life savings quietly drained by predatory, greedy relatives. They were entirely defenseless, stripped of their voices and their legal rights, just as I had almost been. I refused to simply sit back and enjoy my recovered wealth while others suffered in the terrifying silence I had narrowly escaped. I decided to take immediate, concrete action. I took $100,000 of my recovered life savings and legally established a dedicated nonprofit organization. I named it the Catherine Shield, honoring the profound compassion and unyielding strength of my late wife. The organization operates as a relentless legal defense fund. We hire elite private investigators, forensic accountants, and aggressive attorneys to provide completely free, comprehensive legal intervention for elderly victims of financial abuse and forced guardianships. We actively investigate predatory facilities like Oakhaven, fighting to restore the dignity, stolen assets, and legal autonomy of those who have been maliciously discarded by their own families. Gregory even came out of his retirement to serve as our lead forensic consultant, using his decades of federal experience to track down hidden assets and expose financial predators. Every single case we win feels like a personal triumph over the darkness that almost consumed me. Today, I am sitting peacefully on the wooden front porch of my perfectly restored, solid brick house. A beautifully warm morning breeze gently rustles the vibrant green leaves of the towering oak trees, lining the incredibly quiet, familiar suburban street. I hold a large, steaming mug of strong black coffee tightly in my aged hands, feeling the wonderfully comforting, familiar heat seep deeply into my skin. The large brick house behind me is incredibly quiet today, but it is certainly no longer a silent, lonely monument to the distant past. It is a secure, vibrant sanctuary. I do not mourn the terrible loss of my deceitful son anymore today. The harrowing journey of the past 6 months taught me a profound, undeniable truth about the nature of love and loyalty. Blood does not automatically make a family. True family is forged entirely through mutual respect, unwavering honesty, and fundamental human decency. I have built a new, beautiful life dedicated to protecting those who cannot protect themselves. I am 77 years old, but as I look out over my garden, I feel like my true purpose has only just begun. I am truly alive, I am completely secure in my home, and I am finally at absolute peace with myself. The greatest tragedy of aging is not the loss of physical strength, but the terrifying vulnerability it creates in the eyes of those we love. We spend our lives building a solid foundation, believing our bloodline will protect it. But greed is a toxic poison that can rot even the deepest familial bonds. This story teaches us that unconditional love should never mean unconditional trust. Protect your assets, guard your legal rights, and never allow the fear of loneliness to make you a victim. True family honors your sacrifice. Those who view you as a burden are merely predators disguised. Have you or someone you know ever faced financial manipulation from a trusted family member? How did you find the strength to fight back? Share your story in the comments below. Do not forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of hard-earned justice.